Hi class, this is the intro video for our novel study for quarter 3. We're going to be looking at The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. And before we get going into the actual reading, which will come later in this video, I wanted to go over the expectations and the schedule for the novel study. All right. So the novel study, the general schedule for it, we're going to take 2 to 3 weeks to read the entire novel. Okay, we're not going to stop after section to section and then do some discussion questions. I want to read the entire novel front to back first. Okay, and you'll have those readings in class and using these YouTube videos that'll be posted to the class website. You won't be able to comment on the videos. If you have any questions or comments, you can reply to the post that's put on the classroom or just wait until we get in the class. Okay. Once we've read the entire chapter beginning to end, we're going to go back and do a chapter by chapter overview. And that's when we'll focus on vocabulary, comprehension, and specific skill review. Also during that time, you're going to have, chapter or selection quizzes. I haven't decided how I'm going to set that up yet. And test, comprehension, reading comprehension test, and vocabulary test. And finally, we're going to end out the quarter with a project. You'll work on them for a week, but you'll be able to choose what project you want well ahead of time. I'll probably start pulling those out during the second or third week of the chapter by chapter overview so you can make your decision. But we'll work on it in class for a week. You'll have a choice. I usually give 3 choices, give 3 options to students, and you guys can choose from those. Each of those choices will reflect knowledge of the objectives that'll be introduced for this novel unit, this novel study. Technology usage. So you'll need to be able to make a video or do a PowerPoint, something along those lines, and presentation skills. Okay, so you will have to do a presentation with this particular unit study. All right. I wanted to go over to the 3-2-1 questions. The 3-2-1 questions are review questions related to the section that we just read. In general, for this one, they're listed for chapter 1. Your 3-2-1 questions are listed below. For each of the videos that you'll have for the novel read, I'll go ahead and give you the questions beforehand so you'll know what to look for as you're reading. Keep in mind, though, that you have to submit your answers using the link provided in the classroom website. You guys are all familiar with Google Forms. That's what we'll be using for these as well. The links are going to be posted on the homepage and on the novel study page of the classroom website. If you have an issue getting to the classroom website, just remember that I saved on all of the computers in the classroom and in the computer lab at school. It's saved in the toolbar at the top. Okay. All right. So these are the 3-2-1 questions for chapter 1. They are going to switch up chapter to chapter. So, don't think that this is just what it's going to be. All right. So 3, describe 3 things from the novel setting. Okay. 2, name the protagonist and the antagonist in the story so far. Okay. I think I changed that question. I changed that question on the actual worksheet. Let's flip over to the actual worksheet. So let's look. So again, this is the Google form. You'll have the link to this on the classroom website. You'll put your name, describe 3 things from the novel setting. That was right. Okay, here we go. This was the change that I made. Name 2 characters from the novel. Which do you think is the protagonist? Okay. The third question is, what is one thing about the story that you have a question about? Or how do you feel about the story so far? So you only need to reply to one of those for that last one and then hit submit. Okay. All right. So let's pop back over. Jones was struggling. Here we go. All right, cool. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our chapter reading. I want you to grab your books. We are going to start reading chapter 1. But before we jump into the reading, I want you to pay attention to the illustrations. So chapter 1 does the beginning where it has actual chapter 1. It doesn't have a page number, but it's got these like almost totally black pages, and you have this black and white illustration of a hand with a knife. It says, Chapter 1, How Nobody Came to the Graveyard. There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. Okay, we flip over to the next page. You see some images there in the illustration. You've got a man with a long black coat. He kind of looks like a butler climbing up some stairs. And you've got this big rug on the floor. It looks like there could be some older stairs or in an older house. All right. So let's jump into the reading, guys. I do need you to have your books open and reading along with my reading. The knife had a handle of polished black bone and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If you sliced it, you might not even know that you had been cut. Or, sorry, if it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut. Not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to that house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. The street door was still open, just a little, where the knife and the man who held it had slipped in, and wisp of nighttime mist slithered and twined into the house through the open door. The man Jack paused on the landing. With his left hand, he pulled a large white handkerchief from the pocket of his black coat, and with it he wiped off the knife and his gloved hand which had been holding it. Then he put the handkerchief away. The hunt was almost over. He had left the woman in her bed, the man on the bedroom floor, the older child in her brightly colored bedroom, surrounded by toys and half-finished models. That only left the little one, a baby, barely a toddler, to take care of. One more and his task would be done. So on this page, you've got some more images. It looks like you can see a different angle from him walking up the steps. You see lamps and a little side table and some pictures on the wall. He flexed his fingers. The man Jack was, above all things, a professional, or so he told himself, and he would not allow himself to smile until the job was completed. His hair was dark and his eyes were dark, and he wore black leather gloves of the thinnest lamb skin. The toddler's room was at the very top of the house. The man Jack walked up the stairs, his feet silent in the carpeting, or on the carpeting. Then he pushed open the attic door and he walked in. His shoes were black leather and they were polished to such a shine that they looked like dark mirrors. You could see the moon reflected in them, tiny and half full. The real moon shone through the casement window. Its light was not bright and it was diffused by the mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. The moonlight was enough. It would do. He could make out the shape of the baby in the crib, head and limbs and torso. The crib had high, slatted sides to prevent the child from getting out. Jack leaned over, raised his right hand, the one holding the knife, and he aimed for the chest. And then he lowered his hand. The shape in the crib was a teddy bear. There was no child. The man Jack's eyes were accustomed to the dim moonlight, so he had no desire to turn on an electric light. And light was not that important after all. He had other skills. The man Jack sniffed the air. He ignored the sense that had come into the room with him, dismissed the sense that he could safely ignore, honed in on the smell of the thing he had come to find. He could smell the child, a milky smell, like chocolate chip cookies, and the sour tang of wet, disposable nighttime diaper. He could smell the baby's shampoo in its hair, and something small and rubbery, a toy he thought, and then no, something to suck, that the child had been carrying. The child had been there. It was there no longer. The man Jack followed his nose down the stairs through the middle of the tall, thin house. He inspected the bathroom, the kitchen, the airing cupboard, and finally the downstairs hall, in which there was nothing to be seen but the family's bicycles, a pile of empty shopping bags, a fallen diaper, and the stray tendrils of fog that had insinuated themselves into the hall from the open door to the street. The man Jack made a small noise then, a grunt that contained in it both frustration and also satisfaction. He slipped the knife into its sheath in the inside pocket of his long coat, and he stepped out into the street. There was moonlight, and there were street lights, but the fog stifled everything, muted light and muffled sound, and made the night shadowy and treacherous. He looked down the hill towards the light of the closed shops, then up the street, where the last high houses wound up the hill on their way to the darkness of the old graveyard. The man Jack sniffed the air. Then, without hurrying, he began to walk up the hill. Ever since the child had learned to walk, he had been his mother's and father's despair and delight. For there never was such a boy for wandering, for climbing up things, for getting into and out of things. That night, he had been woken by the sound of something on the floor beneath him falling with a crash. Awake, he soon became bored, and he began looking for a way out of his crib. It had high sides, like the walls of his playpen downstairs, but he was convinced that he could scale it. All he needed was a step. He pulled his large golden teddy bear into the corner of the crib. Then, holding the railing with his tiny hands, he put his foot into the bear's lap, the other foot up on the bear's head, and he pulled himself up into a standing position. And then he half climbed, half toppled over the railing and out of the crib. He landed with a muffled thump on a small mound of furry, fuzzy toys, some of them presents from relations from his first birthday, not 6 months gone. Some of them inherited from his older sister. He was surprised when he hit the floor, but he did not cry out. If he cried, they came and put him back and put you back in your crib. He crawled out of the room. Stairs that went up were tricky things, and he had not yet entirely mastered them. Stairs that went down, however, he had discovered were fairly simple. He did them sitting down, bumping from step to step on his well-padded bottom. He sucked on his number, the rubber pacifier his mother had just begun to tell him that he was getting too old for. His diaper had worked itself loose on its journey on his bottom down the stairs, and when he reached the last step, when he reached the little hall and stood up, the diaper fell off. He stepped out of it. He was only wearing a child's nightshirt. The stairs that led back up to his room and his family were steep, but the door to the street was open and inviting. The child stepped out of the house a little hesitantly, the fall wreathed around him like a long-lost friend, and then, uncertainly at first, then with increasing speed and confidence, the boy tottered up the hill. The fog was thinner as you approached the top of the hill. The half moon shone, not as bright as day, not by any means, but enough to see the graveyard. Enough for that. Look. You could see the abandoned funeral chapel, iron doors padlocked, ivy on the sides of the spire, a small tree growing out of the guttering, at roof level. You could see stones and tombs and vaults and memorial plaques. You could see the occasional dash or scuttle of a rabbit or a vole or a weasel as it slipped out of the undergrowth and across the path. You would have seen those things in the moonlight if you had been there that night. You might not have seen a pale, plump woman who walked the path near the front gates. And if you had seen her with a second, more careful glance, you would have realized that she was only moonlight, mist, and shadow. The plump, pale woman was there, though. She walked the path that led through the clutch of half fallen tombstones towards the front gates. The gates were locked. They were always locked at 4 in the afternoon in winter, at 8 at night in summer. Spike topped iron railings ran around part of the cemetery, a high brick wall around the rest of it. The bars of the gates were closely spaced. They would have stopped a grown man from getting through, even stopped a 10-year-old child. Owens, called the pale woman in a voice that might have been the rustle of the wind through the long grass. Owens, come and look at this. She crouched down and peered at something on the ground as a patch of shadow moved in the moonlight, revealing itself to be a grizzled man in his mid-40s. He looked down at his wife and then looked at what she was looking at, and he scratched his head. Mistress Owens, he said, for he came from a more formal age than our own. Is that what I think it is? And at that moment, the thing he was inspecting seemed to catch sight of Mrs. Owens, for it opened its mouth, letting the rubber nipple it was sucking fall to the ground, and it reached out a small chubby fist as if it were trying for all the world to hold on to Mrs. Owens' pale finger. Strike me silly, said Mr. Owens, if that isn't a baby. Of course it's a baby, said the wife, and the question is, what is to be done with it? I dare say that is a question, Mistress Owens, said her husband, and yet it is not our question, for this here baby is unquestionably alive, and as such is nothing to do with us, and is no part of our world. Look at him smile, said Mrs. Owens. He has the sweetest of smiles. And with one insubstantial hand, she stroked the child's sparse blonde hair. The little boy giggled with delight. A chilly breeze blew across the graveyard, scattering the fall in the lower slopes of the place. For the graveyard covered the whole top of the hill, and its paths wound up the hill and down and back upon themselves. A rattling. Someone at the main gate of the graveyard was pulling and shaking it, rattling the old gates and the heavy padlock and chain that held them. There now, said Owens. It's the baby's family. It's the babe's family come to bring him back to the loving bosom. Leave the little man be, he added, because Mrs. Owens was putting her insubstantial arms around the toddler, smoothing and stroking. Mrs. Owens said, he don't look like anybody's family, that one. The man in the dark coat had given up on rattling the main gates and was now examining the smaller side gate. It, too, was well locked. There had been some vandalism in the graveyard the previous year, and the council had taken steps. Come on, Mistress Owens, leave it be. There's a dear, said Mr. Owens, when he saw a ghost and his mouth dropped open and he found himself unable to think of anything to say. You might think, and if you did, you would be right, that Mrs. Owens should not have taken on so at seeing a ghost, given that Mr. and Mrs. Owens were themselves dead and had been for a few hundred years now, and given that the entirety of their social life, or very nearly, was spent with those who were also dead. But there is a difference between the folks of the graveyard and this. A raw, flickering, startling shape of the gray color of television static, all panic and naked emotion which flooded the Owenses as if it were their own. Three figures, two large, one smaller, but only one of them was in focus, was more than an outline or a shimmer, and the figure said, "My baby! He is trying to harm my baby." A clattering. The man outside was hauling a heavy metal garbage can across the alley to the high brick wall that ran around that part of the graveyard. "Protect my son," said the ghost, and Mrs. Owens thought it was a woman. Of course, the babe's mother. "What did he do to you?" asked Mrs. Owens, but she was not certain that the ghost could hear her. Recently dead, poor love, she thought. It's always easier to die gently, to wake in due time in the place you were buried, to come to terms with your death and get acquainted with the other inhabitants. This creature was nothing but alarm and fear for her child and her panic, which felt to the Owenses like a low-pitched screaming, was now attracting attention, for other pale figures were coming from all over the graveyard. "Who are you?" Caius Pompeius asked the figure. His headstone was now only a weathered lump of rock, but 2,000 years earlier he had asked to be laid to rest under the mound beside the marble shrine, rather than to have his body sent back to Rome. And he was one of the most senior citizens of the graveyard. He took his responsibilities extremely seriously. "Are you buried here?" "Of course she's not. Freshly dead by the look of her." Mrs. Owens put an arm around the woman's shape and spoke to it privately in a low voice, calm and sensible. There was a thump and a crash from the high wall beside the alley. The garbage can had fallen. A man clambered up upon the top of the wall, a dark outline against the mist-smudged streetlights. He paused for a moment, then climbed down the other side, holding on to the top of the wall, legs dangling, then let himself fall the last few feet down into the graveyard. "But my dear," Mrs. Owens said to the shape, now all that was left of the three shapes that had appeared in the graveyard, "he's living, we're not. Can you imagine?" The child was looking up at them, puzzled. It reached for one of them, then another, finding nothing but air. The woman shape was fading fast. "Yes," said Mrs. Owens, in response to something that no one else had heard. "If we can, then we will." Then she turned to the man beside her. "And you, Owens, will you be a father to this little lad?" "Will I what?" said Owens, his brow crinkling. "We never had a child," said his wife, "and his mother wants us to protect him. Will you say yes?" The man in the black coat had tripped on the tangle of ivy and half-broken headstones. Now he got to his feet and walked forward more carefully, startling an owl which rose on silent wings. He could see the baby, and there was triumph in his eyes. Owens knew that what his wife was thinking when she used that tone of voice. They had not, in life and in death, been married for over 250 years for nothing. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Sure as I ever have been of anything," said Mrs. Owens. "Then yes. If you'll be its mother, I'll be its father." "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Owens asked the flickering shape in the graveyard, now little more than an outline, like distinct summer lightning in the shape of a woman. It said something to her that no one else could hear, and then it was gone. "She'll not come here again," said Mr. Owens. "Next time she wakes, it'll be in her own graveyard or wherever it is she's going." Mrs. Owens bent down to the baby and extended her arms. "Come now," she said warmly. "Come to Mama." To the man Jack, walking through the graveyard towards them on a path, his knife already in his hand, it seemed as if a swirl of mist had curled around the child in the moonlight, and that the baby was no longer there, just damp mist and moonlight and swaying grass. He blinked and sniffed the air. Something had happened, but he had no idea what it was. He growled in the back of his throat like a beast of prey, angry and frustrated. "Hello?" called the man Jack, wondering if perhaps the child had stepped behind something. His voice was dark and rough, and there was an edge to it, as if of surprise or puzzlement at hearing himself speak. The graveyard kept its secrets. "Hello," he called again. He hoped to hear a baby cry or utter a half word or to hear it move. He did not expect what he actually heard, a voice, silky smooth, saying, "Can I help you?" The man Jack was tall. This man was taller. The man Jack wore dark clothes. This man's clothes were darker. People who noticed the man Jack when he was about his business and he did not like to be noticed were troubled or made uncomfortable or found themselves unaccountably scared. The man Jack looked up at the stranger, and it was the man Jack who was troubled. So we're going to stop right there because this recording has gotten to 26 minutes. So what I want you to do, I want you to go ahead and, before we move on, we stop right in the middle of page 18. I still want you to go ahead and answer those questions for chapter 1, the graveyard book. Make sure that you reply to all of the questions as assigned. You'll also answer again once we get to the very end of chapter 1, and we'll see you'll have another set of questions for the very end of chapter 1. So for today, I do want you to go ahead and go to the link for the graveyard book for chapter 1 and answer those questions. All right, just real quick. Let's see, I got one more slide. All right, so again, go to the classroom website and complete your 3-2-1 questions. The due date can be found on the classroom website. We could actually go ahead and get through this today. So yeah, but I'll decide exactly what the due date is going to be once I get over to the classroom website and post. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed. Talk to you later. Bye.